Okay, go back. I told you I need a reminder. All right, so anywho. Okay, so that's what I was just saying. So that chapter 3 review questions and case studies, that's what that is. Okay, guys? All the recorded lectures are there as well. Also, I did, and I reminded you guys of this, right? I put up another assignment for that COVID and host genetics article. That's due Friday. Okay, so I give you a little extra time on that. So make sure you guys get that done. Like I said, we'll go over the chapter 2-3 quiz, and then what did I want to show you? Oh, here. So see where it says Unit 1, chapter 1 through 4 summaries and review questions. That's where those are. Okay, there's PDFs there. So I'll show you what am I referring to. So if you have the textbook, this is in the textbook, but if you don't have the textbook, it's there for you. So I put chapters 2, 3, and 4 all together, all right? So it'll open eventually. Let me just show you guys. It's not gonna have the answers to the review questions, right? It just has those review questions. So like I said, most of the time we're going over the review questions so you can listen to the lecture. Okay, so summary and then review questions for each chapter. All right, guys? Like I said, it's right from the textbook. So if you have the textbook, you're not gonna need that. All right. Let me go back. All right, guys, let's go over that quiz first. Anyone have any questions? So we're, yeah. No. No, the exam's going to take you most of the class period to take. Yeah. Yeah. Correct. Yep. Yeah. I mean, whatever the time limit, I think I set it for an hour and a half. So whatever time limit is set on Moodle is, you know, appropriate to what it is, but mostly it's most of the class period. So no lecture after, okay? Remember for the exam though, guys, you're gonna log in at 2 p.m. on Wednesday, right? Everyone's gonna take it together with their camera on. And just like we did that for one quiz, I think, right? Did we? Yeah, for the first quiz. Okay, any other exam related questions? Yeah. It'll probably be like an hour and a half. Yeah. It'll probably be about 40 to 50 multiple choice and then some essays, maybe like 4 essays. Maybe figure like an essay question for each chapter, which probably will be like a case study type of question just because we've done those, right? So I don't want to throw out anything crazy at you. It doesn't necessarily have to be one of the case studies that are in the chapter, but most likely it'll be like an excerpt from one of those and then me asking you a question about it, okay? If you notice, especially with this case study, and we'll go over it, sometimes the questions, the way the book asks the questions, they're like a little vague. I'll make sure that when I ask you a question, it's specific and you know what I'm trying to ask you, okay? And the other thing is with those too, there's multiple correct answers, right? There's no right answer for those case studies. And I was just saying this in my other class, there's probably wrong answers, but there's not one right answer, right? So as long as you're reasoning through it and your answer, you know, shows me that you understand the material, then you'll probably do well on them, okay? Yeah, go ahead. Say it again. I'll tell you, probably like 2 to 3 sentences. They're not gonna be super long. Yeah. So I may, and I'll kind of give you some hints if I'm gonna, for the most part, consider the essays as being case study-like, okay? But like for chapter 4, I could definitely come up with probably a bunch of different essays that I could ask you that wouldn't necessarily be a case study, but probably be some kind of scenario type question, okay? And so we can review, so on Monday, right, I'll leave that as a review. I'm not gonna start something new even though I pushed back the exam, okay? I will upload like the next chapter's lecture, but you don't have to worry about it until after the exam, right? So I'll expect that you guys all would have listened to that for the following week. But Monday I'll leave for review. So any questions that you guys have, you guys hear this too, right? Any questions you really have that you want me to go over more, please bring them on Monday and say, hey, Dr. Kaminsky, can you go over this, right? Or can you go over this? Or I'm not really sure about this. Bring them up, so then that will kind of prompt the review. I don't have time, obviously, to review everything, right? So I want to make sure I hit kind of what you guys need, okay? So come prepared on Monday for questions, yeah? Does that make sense? for everyone? Something I just thought of. It'll come back to me. Anyway, it'll come back to me. I forgot what it was. Anything else, guys, right now? No? Yeah. Yeah, so for this coming Monday, yeah. So I'll let you guys know. I'll send you an email tomorrow or Friday to let you know if I'll be here in person or if it'll just be virtual on Monday. Yep. Okay, so let's go over chapter 2-3 quiz, okay? The one thing, again, for chapter 3, I stress looking at the case studies for chapter 3, because chapter 3, the way it's sort of presented, right, in the lecture, it's kind of like broad, right? Kind of, but all the specific kind of examples, a lot of that comes from the case studies, okay? So again, I'm not expecting you to memorize the specific stuff, but you want to kind of be familiar with kind of how some of those case studies. So hint, hint, I'll probably use one of those case studies on the exam, okay? Again, I'm not going to ask you the same questions, but be familiar with those, okay? So if you never look at those case studies, you're going to put yourself at a disadvantage, all right? Okay, you guys all can hear me okay on Zoom? All right, cool. Okay, so let's go over that quiz. Move you guys out of the way. There's no room for me to even like move the mouse. That's why it's having a lot of trouble here. All right. Okay, so number 1 there, in individuals, ooh, that's terrible. Terrible quality, huh? Can you guys even see that? I guess I should turn lights down. You want to turn lights down? What do you think? Lights off, lights down, right? Is that better? I don't want to shut all of them off, so I feel like it'll be too bad. Okay, so this is a pretty easy question, right? An individual's home is considered what part, or part of what kind of environment? What is it? Physical, right? All right, cool. So what are some environmental hazards or some things that people can be exposed to that sort of come from the home or arise from like the physical, I guess, structure kind of thing? What can you, I don't know, what would you think? Yeah. Okay, asbestos, carbon monoxide, good. Those are 2 good ones. Carbon monoxide was the one I was thinking of. What else? Smoke from a fire. Yep, good. Anything else you guys are thinking of? Yeah. Gas. Gas? Yeah, like natural gas. Yeah, good. Anything you guys can think of on Zoom over here?
Mold.
Say it again.
Mold.
Okay, good. Mold. That's a good one. Yep, exactly. All right, good. So you can guys, again, it's kind of understanding or being able to identify, like if I ask you something like that, we should be able to pull that, we should know that information, right? We should know kind of what hazards are coming from the home and what are coming from, you know, other environmental sources. And that, you know, chapter 3 talks about that. Okay, moving on. All right, so this is coming from chapter 2, right? In DNA, adenine pairs with what nucleotide? Thymine. All right, good. A pairs with T and G pairs with C. Probably doesn't need much more explanation. All right, a point mutation that does not lead to a change in the amino acid sequence of a protein is called what? What do we call that, guys? Silent. Okay, so why is it called silent? Like if we think kind of one step further, what is that going to mean for like disease? You think that then this type of mutation would lead to disease? No, right? Why? So if the amino acid sequence of the protein isn't changed, then what does that mean about the function of the protein? It's not going to change. It's going to remain, right? So you would assume that that protein will function normally, right? If you have a silent mutation. Okay. I'll probably say a little bit more about mutations, but I'll leave it till after the quiz. Yeah, I'll leave it till after. Let's go through this and then I'll remind me to mention something else about that. It's going. So there are those other types of mutations that are listed there, right? We can talk a little bit more about those, right? And what we mean by that. So you guys should be familiar with that, right? Like a missense versus like nonsense. So what is meant by missense? While I wait for this to eventually turn, what's missense mean? Or anyone, any of you guys on Zoom, how would you describe missense? Go ahead. Yeah, so it's going to be a mutation, right, in the DNA, a change in the DNA sequence that's going to then lead to a change in the amino acid sequence, right? It's going to code for a different amino acid, yeah? What about nonsense? What about nonsense? What do we mean by that? I'll spare you guys me hopping up on top of the stage. This is such an awkward room, but I want to come over here to this whiteboard. What does that mean? Nonsense. Anyone? Does it code for it? So it's still a change in the DNA sequence, right? And so in this case, it's not going to code for another amino acid, but what will it code for? You guys know? Anyone? Anyone on Zoom? What do we mean by nonsense? Can you guys even see the...
Does it code for a premature stop codon?
Yeah, it can code for a premature stop codon. So what does that mean?
It will stop making proteins past that point. It won't code for any more amino acids.
Yeah, correct. It won't code for any more amino acids. So let me just go through this kind of to put this into perspective, right? So if we're talking about like DNA sequence, can you guys see this kind of? Probably not. This is super small too. Can you guys see it? Maybe not. All right, anyway. All right, so whatever. Here's our DNA. This is also a little bit of other review. So if the cell's gonna make a protein, what's gonna happen next to this DNA, this portion of the DNA? What do you have to make next to get to a protein? Anyone on Zoom? Go ahead. What's this process though then when we go from DNA to mRNA? Transcription, right? All right, so transcription. So correct, if we just do complementary sequence, we're going to do this. C, C, G. Let's add another G there. C, G, C. Sorry, my G's might look like C's. Okay, so that's our mRNA. Now we're talking about mutations in the DNA, right? But let me just go a little bit further. If we're going to then go from here to protein, now what's that process? Yeah, translation. Okay, so we're not going to go through the details of translation, right? But essentially in the mRNA, you have codons, right? These triplet codons, okay? So this, say, codes for, you know, a certain amino acid. I don't know. Let's say, you don't have to memorize amino acids or whatever, but whatever. Doesn't even matter. So whatever amino acid it's going to code for, right? So glutamine, aspartic acid, and some other amino acid, right? If you change, say you just change this, right? And you make it a G instead. Well, that's going to then change this, right? And then potentially do what? Change this, right? The amino acid, okay? It's only going to change this one amino acid, and then obviously I'm oversimplifying here. Everything down this way will all be all the same amino acids, right? So in that case, this protein is only has one amino acid that's different. You guys all agree? And so maybe there might not even be, that might not even alter its function, okay? Also, this change here, whatever, might not lead to a change in amino acid at all, right? So that was what we were talking about, a silent mutation. So even though you changed DNA sequence, it actually didn't even lead to a change in amino acid. Okay, so in that case, obviously the protein is going to function totally. Okay? Now, so the other example I gave you of changing this and it changed the amino acid was called missense. Okay, so one other thing I just want to point out, well, what happens though if, say, you delete something? right? So say you just delete one nucleotide. Okay, what's going to happen here? This is going to go away, right? And everything's going to shift over. So now this would be here, right? This would be here. And so do you see what's going to happen? Everything down the line will be changed, okay? And so what do you think about that protein that's now going to be made? Do you think it's going to be functional? Unlikely, right? Because you just changed, you potentially could change, I don't know, 50 amino acids, right? Not going to be functional. So those are the types of mutations that generally will lead to disease, okay? So again, putting together kind of the biology, basic biology, and then pathophysiology, right? The other thing that I wanted to mention, the other thing is, we'll say, same kind of thing can happen. If this change that we put here led to this being called, or being coding for a stop codon, right? That was the nonsense. Somebody said that on Zoom. What's going to happen to the rest of the protein? It's not going to be made. So you have like a protein with like 2 amino acids. That's not going to function, right? So again, that a nonsense mutation really could lead to something pretty drastic, okay? But like a deletion or an insertion, those usually have a more dramatic effect than just changing one nucleotide, okay? So again, I just wanted to kind of go through this because that's the whole point of the chapter going through. What's transcription? What's translation? It's to understand how a mutation, a genetic mutation in the DNA can lead to a faulty protein, right? That's all it is, okay? If you don't understand that, you're missing a lot of sort of basic science there to understand kind of how mutations cause disease, okay? Does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone have questions? Okay. All right, so I just wanted to make sure that I went through that. I was supposed to keep this so that nobody else touches it. All right, so let's go back and finish our quiz. All right, so which of the populations listed below are more susceptible to develop disease following an environmental exposure? Me. Right, both newborn children and geriatric patients. Again, understanding that there are, people that are more susceptible, more vulnerable, right? These special populations sort of come up in every chapter. We kind of talk about the geriatric population and how they may be more affected by whatever different situations. Here, we're particularly talking about environmental factors, okay? All right. And by the way, if you have a question about any of these topics, then stop me and we can go over it some more. All right. It's slowly going to the next question. Yeah. Some of these, maybe a couple, but most of the quiz questions they're more straightforward than the exam questions. Remember, the exam questions are more similar to those review questions. Yeah. But there's just some of these are thrown in there. Okay. For this one, what did you guys choose? D, sentinel. Now, I was just telling my other classes too, like, even when I was like doing the lecture for this and kind of like reading through like sentinel, what does it really mean to have a sentinel health event? I couldn't really come up with like some other like great explanation of it. I think it's just kind of being aware of the term. Because my kind of thinking is, well, anything that would be caused by an environmental factor is obviously going to impact more than one person, right? So I think it's just the idea of sort of pinpointing these certain diseases, right? There's a big long table. Nobody needs to memorize any of that. But like I said, I kind of try to find like some other better way to explain this, but I don't know, I got nothing. So just be aware of that term. And I guess the reason why I put it on the quiz is because maybe it's a term that we never really hear that much or we don't really use, but essentially that's what it is, right? So it might be a term that you hear and we want to just be familiar with it, okay? So we're not going to go much further than that with that. All right. Why did that be so slow? All right, next one, hopefully it's coming. That's why I don't want to take your exam here. Awesome. What's the next question? Anyone know? Oh, there we go. Okay. Blank are proteins that bind to DNA and package it into chromosomes. These proteins are also common target of epigenetic regulation. What's the answer here? Histones. Good. We got another epigenetic question, so I'll elaborate on that a little bit more when we get to that question. So as we wait, what's epigenetics? That's another question. I'm going to elaborate on it anyway. How would you define epigenetics? How would you define epigenetics? I know people have given a nice definition when we were on Zoom. Anyone over here? How would you define epigenetics? I think you can turn this guy on too. So is it changes in the gene sequence? Right? What is it? It's changes not in the gene sequence essentially, but that can be passed down, right? So things like histones, like that last example, if you modify them, that can change the way the DNA is packaged and make a segment of the DNA more available to be transcribed and therefore affect gene expression, okay? So that's what you mean by epigenetics. Here, so we'll come back to that again when we go to that. There's another epigenetics question. But here, what'd you guys put for this one? Methylmercury is considered what type of hazard? What'd you say? Chemical? Okay, so what about methylmercury? So there is a case study that specifically focuses on methylmercury in chapter 3. Where do you find methylmercury? What'd you say, fish? Yeah. Okay, and how does it get in the fish? Do they just produce methylmercury? Part of the metabolic process? Yeah, good. It settles into the water. Yeah, so things like coal burning and apparently even volcanic eruptions, right, can produce that methylmercury. It ends up settling in the water, right? And then the fish take it up. Now, so yeah, you get it by eating fish, right? But you have to particularly eat fish in a contaminated area, right? So they do tell pregnant women, right, not to eat a lot of fish because of this, but in actuality, probably most of it's safe. But if for some reason there is some sort of event that then causes a lot of methylmercury to be deposited, right, in the ocean or wherever, lakes there, it could potentially be an issue, right? So like I said, there is a case study in chapter 3 that kind of focuses on methylmercury, okay, in a child. So make sure you take a look at that one. All right. Oh, cool. We lost our connection altogether. Let's see what happens. So by the way, if this happens to you guys, like when you're taking your exam, don't like freak out and then like close Moodle or whatever. Just refresh the page and it usually goes back to right where you were. You probably already experienced this before, but usually it'll pick up, except now in this case, it's not gonna pick up where we left off. Usually it just picks back up right where you left off. Ay, ay, ay. I don't know what that means. So if something like this happens, you gotta let me know. I guess you gotta email me. That's awesome. We'll go back. So what's another type of, and I think they also talk about that in that same case study on methylmercury. The clinician does a test for something else first before taking a methylmercury. And so it's something that particularly will affect children. Chemical exposure. Yeah, lead. I mean, obviously there's a case of that not too long ago around here, right? Lead usually in the water supply or whatever. But it can also, leach into the soil. And it, again, I said it particularly affects young children usually. So why? Does anyone remember what I said about kind of young children or what the book says about that in terms of why they're more susceptible. Okay, all right, good. So Gabriella said they store it in their bones. What about in general too? Why young children are more susceptible to environmental exposures? Yeah, yeah, good, because lead can lead to cognitive effects, right? Why? Children's brains are still developing, and brain still develops, pretty robustly until like age 10, and then even from there, your prefrontal cortex and stuff is still further developing until like age 25, okay, 30, maybe some people to like age 50, but right, so it's going to particularly then affect brain function if you have that development going on. What else? Anyone? Yep. Yeah, good. Their metabolic rate is higher, right? And they sort of have this faster metabolic rate, and so they're going to be more susceptible when they're to exposures, right? Or for those exposures to affect them. All right, good. Those are all the things I was looking for. All right, let's go back to our quiz. Hopefully it lets us go back. I may try to look for another room. Be on the lookout for us to try to meet. Wait, let me see how many of you went. Oh, that's exactly the number I was expecting. I think this is like one of the only rooms that can hold 18 or something like that. Anyway, okay, cool. I'm going to try to move rooms if I can. All right, let's go back. Oh, see, look, it did pick up where we left off. How about that? All right, next one. So methylmercury is a chemical. All right, so here's our other epigenetic question, right? Epigenetic changes in the DNA sequence, or epigenetic changes are changes in the DNA sequence that can be passed on to future generations. Is that true or false? Why is it false? Correct. Epigenetic changes are not changes to the DNA sequence. So we were talking about DNA sequence changes here. That's not what an epigenetic change is. There's no change to the DNA sequence. It's a change where like maybe there's something added to the DNA sequence, or there's some sort of something added to a histone to change its sort of chemical behavior, right? So that it then makes the DNA more available. So they are changes that lead to changes in gene expression, right? You may produce more of a protein or not produce a protein because things are kind of modified, right? So you can kind of see how that can impact health, right? And lead to disease, potentially. For your purposes, you don't need to worry about what specifically, like I'm not going to ask you about a specific example of a epigenetic change, right? So for instance, things like acetylation, adding an acetyl group to a histone. That's not for you guys, you don't have to worry about that. In cell bio, your biology major, we go through things like that, but you don't have to necessarily need to know those specifics, okay? Just understand that these are changes that occur to molecules that interact with the DNA, right? But not the DNA itself. It could even be adding a methyl group to the DNA, okay? But it's not changing the sequence, okay? Does anyone have more questions about that? Because I feel like, I don't know, the epigenetics kind of concept is kind of a little difficult probably to conceptualize. So if you're still having a little bit of trouble with it, let me know. Or if you want me to go over it more, let me know. But basically, just know that it's not a change in the DNA sequence. But it can be passed down. That's the thing, right? All right. I feel like I should hurry up, right? Otherwise, it's going to boot me out again. All right. So, we already went through this, right? Which process converts DNA into mRNA? What do you call that? Transcription. All right, so I'll ask you this. So I have replication up there. What about replication? Can you guys think of a disease that might be associated with replication? Or like, how could replication be related to pathophysiology, I guess? What do you think? I don't know if this is okay. I think that's a good sort of train of thought there. and actually potentially right before, that's going to happen during meiosis, but that is a form of cell division, and you have to replicate DNA before cell division. So yeah, I'll take that. Okay. What else? What's something else you might think of? Yeah, cancer. Why do you say that? Well, what do you think if you think about the cell and what do we mean by replication or DNA replication? What happens in replication? Copies the entire genome, right? All the DNA is copied, every single gene, right? And then when does the cell do that? Before it's going to do what? Yeah, before it goes to cell division, right? So if you think about mitosis, right? This is cell division, right? When does cell division occur? During growth, right? During repair, when you want to make more cells, okay? And what happens in cancer? You have overgrowth of cells, right? And so yeah, so that's the one that I was thinking of. You can kind of relate replication to cancer. Those cells that are dividing out of control keep replicating their DNA and dividing when they shouldn't, right? So it's this sort of out of control cell division. All right, so anyway, I wanted to throw that out there because again, you might be thinking, why should I care? Why would you even mention replication or transcription or translation, right? All right, so I know we talked about this before and I probably gave the same example. I always use cystic fibrosis as an example for whatever reason, I don't know why. I should get another autosomal recessive disease in my mind, but I always use it as an example. So anyway, if an individual has a heterozygous genotype, right? The individual is affected by the disorder, meaning they have the disorder. Is that true or false? It's false, correct. And so why? Why is it false? Yeah, so if we're talking about an autosomal recessive disorder, you will only express the disorder, have the disease, if you are homozygous recessive, right? 2 little c. All right, so what do we call that person with that genotype? Carrier. Good. Okay, we call them a carrier because they're carrying that diseased allele, even though they themselves don't have that disease, right? If this was an autosomal dominant disorder, okay, would that person have the disease? Yes, you only need one dominant allele. Okay, all right, good. So make sure we know the difference between that and what these genotypes mean. All right, is that our last one? Yeah. Hopefully we got them all right. All right, good job, guys. We got 100. All right, so any other questions right now? No? Okay. So like I said, for chapter 3, obviously we were hopefully listening to the recorded lectures and we did already. But also make sure you go through those case studies, you go through the review questions, and then you can listen to that recording where I review them. Okay, guys? What I want to do now is move into that chapter 4 case study, go over that, and then we can review some more of the material from chapter 4. Again, on Monday, come prepared with questions, right? So that I can specifically go over some other things. But I can kind of spend even some extra time going over some of the chapter 4 stuff too after we go over the case study, okay? All right. Any other questions there on Zoom about anything, guys? Maybe I should move this. I don't know if that helps. Kind of. All right, wait, I'm moving the camera, sorry, because I probably won't go back to the whiteboard. And if I do, I'll move it back. Okay. All right, so just a quick kind of review, and I'm gonna have to pull up the PowerPoint, I guess. When we talk about stress, just like in general, let's kind of think about this sort of conceptually. What do we mean, right? What is stress, I guess, for you? So tell me something that's stressful to you. College, okay, an exam. What else? What are some other things that people find, or maybe you find stressful, or whatever, or just in general, it's stressful to some people? Work, good. What else? Illness, okay. Other things? Relationships, good. These are all kind of general things that people find stressful. What about you guys on Zoom? So does anyone not find school stressful? Really? Everyone does? Yeah, I guess you're right. I mean, I guess I would probably say the same thing when I was in school. Now I'm like, oh, why are you guys so stressed? Come on. But all right. I guess so what I'm trying to get at, right, if we kind of think of stress, I mean, the stimulus, right, all those things that you guys just talked about, it's not really, that's not the most important part of it, right? It's the perception, right? So again, everyone can experience the same stimuli, right? But only some people might feel stressed about it, right? Only some people might have, increased heart rate and start sweating, or what have you, right? So only some people may have a physiological response. So what's the difference there? Why is that true? Why would some people be affected by that stress, or why would that stimuli evoke a stress response in some people, but not in others? Okay, coping. Good. So what do we mean by coping? Okay, good. So people know how to manage their stress. So when we talk about coping, it really is a deliberate thing, right? How are you going to deal or manage that stress? So if we're on the subject of coping, what are some mechanisms, coping mechanisms? Okay, meditation, what else? Exercise, yeah. Therapy. Some people might find exercise stressful, right? And that might not be a good coping mechanism for them. So these are also individual as well. What else? Okay, good. Yeah, any kind of like hobby or activity like painting or something like that. What else? What are some other coping mechanisms? Yeah, somebody said that, meditation. I mean, even just talking to a friend, right? Like, what have you, right? Well, these are all healthy coping mechanisms. What are some unhealthy ways to cope with stress? Yeah, alcohol, drugs, right? What else? Overeating. Yeah, right? Overeating, good. Yeah, any type of addictive behavior, right? Gambling, spending money, right? What else? Yeah, good. Yeah, so not sort of talking to people and kind of, very good. So we're all aware of healthy coping mechanisms and unhealthy ones, right? Again, important to be aware of these because you're going to convey these to your patient. Or you want to be, again, when you're taking a health history, right, and talking to your patient, be able to identify this. Like, all right, yeah, maybe they shouldn't be doing this. This isn't a healthy way to cope, and kind of get at, well, what's really going on, right? And talk to them about, well, here's some better ways to deal with it, right? All right. So say there's some stimuli, right? You try these coping mechanisms, and maybe, I don't know, they're not so successful, right? What's going to happen then physiologically in your body? What are some of the responses? Say louder. Heart races. Okay, heart races, and that's a result of what system being activated? Sympathetic, right? So activation of the sympathetic nervous system leads to things like sweating, increased heart rate, right? All these kind of these types of responses. What do we call that? What's a kind of a general term that we use for that sort of activation of sympathetic activity? Fight or flight, right? All right, good. Okay, so that's one sort of pathway that becomes activated. So what hormones do we primarily associate with that response, that fight or flight? Not with fight or flight, right? With sympathetic, what hormones do we associate them with? Yeah, norepinephrine and epinephrine. Remember that epinephrine and adrenaline, it's the same thing, just two different names, same molecule, okay? And where are those released from in your body? Epinephrine and norepinephrine? Say it. Go ahead, say it louder. Adrenal gland, particularly adrenal medulla. Okay? All right. So, and I can review that pathway and go over specifics. I do expect you guys really to know the specifics of these pathways that are activated, right? This is physiologically what's going on in your body, following stress. And if prolonged activation of these pathways can lead to disease, right? And we talk about some of those at the end of the chapter. So it's important that you know those details, okay? What's another pathway that's activated besides sympathetic, right? Norepinephrine, what else? Yeah, HPA axis, right? What does HPA stand for? Hypothalamic. What's the P? Pituitary adrenal axis, right? And what's the end result of the activation of the HPA axis? What hormone is released? You said it before. Cortisol, right? Okay. We say that that's our stress hormone. Okay. I guess you can kind of think of, again, epinephrine, norepinephrine, fight or flight, that immediate kind of activation, right? That somebody comes at you and you got to run away or you got to do something about it, right? That's sort of innately what that system is for, right? Now, the book kind of mentioned this, and I mentioned this too. You know, there's a lot of talk, or a lot of people say that maybe evolutionarily sort of speaking, or now, that fight or flight response isn't so useful to us. So what do we mean by that? Like, why nowadays is it really not so useful? Maybe. What do you think?
Well, if you're just looking at it on a day-to-day basis, you're not in like life or death situation. Right. It's more like I have to make this payment, and now I feel like I'm having this response to like fight for my life, but that's not going to do anything because that's physical.
Yeah, I think that's good. That's a really good description, right? Day to day, are you really faced with like somebody with like a gun in your, you know, like are those really what's happening day to day? Sure, some of that kind of stuff does happen, right? But day to day, is that activation of a sympathetic activity and that fight or flight response really useful, right? Probably not. So like, you know, if somebody says something you don't like, it's probably not a good idea to punch them in the face, right? That's fight or flight, right? That's what's going to get you to that point. Probably not a good decision, right? So there is definitely a lot of, if you kind of think about that, it does kind of make sense. I don't know, what, in a million years, maybe that response won't happen anymore. I don't know, right? But something to kind of think about. So when you're kind of thinking about the function of that or how that makes you feel, that's the feeling. Everyone's felt it before, right? The HPA axis is kind of like a more prolonged kind of, and it has different effects, okay? But both are going to be activated during stress, okay? All right, what's another, there's one other pathway that I mentioned in the lecture and that the book mentions, but then we don't really talk about it much more. Anyone remember? Yeah, so somebody else said that, so it's kind of confusing. So I'll probably have to clarify this a little bit more on Monday. We also then talk about this LC and E, right, norepinephrine pathway. That's really referring to kind of what's going on in the central nervous system in the brain, right? So it's kind of the perception part of it, right? So we said everyone can be, you know, faced with the same stimuli, but only some people might feel stressed. So it's about perception. So that stimuli coming in gets processed, right? And some of those brain regions that are sort of mentioned, there's a figure that shows you the brain regions, right? Those are all involved in kind of perceiving that stress and saying kind of like, all right, should I initiate the stress response or maybe not, right? And so I think you can kind of think of like the LC, locus coeruleus, it's a brain stem, right, like nuclei, that's sort of maybe the first step in sort of initiating the fight or flight response, okay? So it's not really separate, but it's kind of weird the way it's presented. So somebody else thought the same thing. But there's one other thing that they mentioned, or that I mentioned, the book mentions it too. Another pathway, they kind of list three. And I think we set it up right in the beginning, it's like on slide 1 or 2. Anyone?
Oh, is it the opioid?
Yeah, so it mentions endogenous opioid pathway. So like I could talk for days about that, but I'll spare you guys the details. But it doesn't really, we don't really get into those details. So I guess the point is you don't have to worry about those details right now. But the idea is that that's kind of like, think about that as being a system that's going to kind of like interact with both of the pathways that we talked about. And usually, if you think about opioids or opiates, right, they have a sedative inhibitory effect. And so you can kind of think of them or that system as sort of being there to kind of tone things down. Okay. I think I gave this example too. Like you said, exercise is a coping mechanism, right? Physiologically, if you kind of think about that, why might exercise be a good coping mechanism for stress? of stress on your body. Yeah, that's true. All right, what else? Right.
It can produce like endorphins, like in your brain, like happy, like happy.
Yeah, so like that was what I was trying to get at. It's a very roundabout way of getting to it. But we're talking about endogenous opioid system, right? So you ever hear of like runner's high, and if you're exercising, it increases levels of endorphins. Endorphins bind to the same receptor as morphine and heroin, right? So those are the endogenous opiates, right? So that's part of it too. Okay, so if you kind of think about it on a different level, that's also part of the reason why it might be helpful. Okay. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of bring that up and just know that it kind of throws that out there, but then I don't really talk about it that much more. But think of it kind of in that way, I guess, as sort of a kind of a counteracting sort of mechanism to those two stress cascades that are activated. Okay? Yeah? All right. Okay, so let's now talk about this case study, which brings about kind of all these things we just talked about. Okay? And there is one other case study in chapter 4 as well, so we'll take a look at that too. But let's go over this one here. Any questions, guys? Any questions on Zoom over here? Anyone? No, you guys are all still there. Everyone's all right. All right. Oh, it downloaded that super quick. Oh, wait, one thing. See, I did this last time too. One thing I'm gonna do, 1 second, guys. I'm gonna pull from my email I have a Word document that basically has the answers to these case studies. So I'm gonna pull it up and make sure it's on the screen so you guys can check back and take a look at that as we go over it. I also like to always look kind of see what the book puts as their answers, knowing that you guys are gonna give me other answers and those probably are correct as well, okay? 1 second. So now I'm gonna show you my email, whatever. How about I just search my name? What the hell? Sorry, I shouldn't have done that. One second, it's here somewhere, I swear. Okay. All right, so I should have had that ready for you. Sorry about that. Actually, we can get rid of that. Okay, so, all right, so take a look at this just to familiarize yourself with the introduction, I guess, to this case study here. All right, so for question number 1, does somebody want to share what they wrote down for that? Okay, good. And so, yeah, the idea of just saying, hey, it can lead to disease. Yep, true. And so, very good. That's a good answer. What else? What are some other things you might have written down for that? Any of you guys on Zoom here? What else did you write? No one wants to share anything else? Well, go ahead. Okay. Okay, good. What about things like substance abuse, right? Could potentially lead to something like that as well. Okay, but the idea is kind of thinking about it can lead to disease, right? All right, good. Okay, so for that second question there, what physiologic symptoms is Mr. Cho manifesting secondary to his stress response? So this is kind of an easy, I guess, question, I guess you can kind of pull out just from what's written there. But in terms of those symptoms, what are some symptoms that are sort of a direct result of the activation of the sympathetic nervous system? Say again? Okay, potentially, but even just like chest pain, the sweating, right? It's kind of just kind of ask you that. But again, like I told you guys too, this is kind of a weird way to phrase the question, right? So I'll make sure that my questions are clear, just so you guys know. Okay, so I'm not gonna just like throw these same questions at you and then like we're like, nope, that's not what I was expecting. It'll be clear, okay? But that's kind of what they're trying to get at there. So the idea of remembering, right, that a stressful stimuli will evoke a stress response, right? And that stress response, if you're talking about increased sympathetic activity, leads to things like heart palpitations or sweating, right? Chest pain, those types of things, okay? So let me just show you guys, again, this is just pulled right from the book there, right? So it's like super straightforward, short answers. So for your guys' essays on the exam, I'll probably say answered in 2 to 3 sentences or something like that. So probably, I'm not going to give you guys a question that maybe you can answer it in 1 word. It might be just a little bit more, but I'll make sure I tell you guys kind of what I'm expecting then, okay? Make sense? All right. So if we move on to the next part here, we can, again, I can also make this bigger. Maybe we still can read it. Okay. So take a look at that, remind yourself of that, and then let's talk about that next question. All right, so it says, as his chronic sense of physiologic arousal continues, what factors are being activated? So now we're kind of asking, all right, what's going on, right, to cause some of the things that we're talking about? I kind of alluded to it, I guess, before, but what'd you guys write for that question? What's going on there? Somebody share what they wrote for that question. Go ahead.
I said something kind of along the lines of like his emotional and cognitive functioning is being affected because he's having trouble with his memory.
Okay.
So it's starting to then alter his, he's having personality and behavioral issues.
Okay. All right, good. Yeah. What else? Yeah. Okay. In terms of, yes, right. So activation of the HPA axis, activation of the sympathetic nervous system is what's leading to some of these issues that we're mentioning. Let's take a look here what it's saying here, right? So that's basically what it's saying. All right, tell me what pathways are activated. We already talked about this, right? So it also mentions here immune responses. So that kind of like reminded me to remind you guys. So, and I say this in the lecture as well. The relationship between stress, right, or even activation of stress responses and the immune system is super complex. So at this point in your life, don't try to understand it, okay? There are many studies that show that there's a suppressed effect of it, right? Particularly if you're talking about cortisol. But there are many other studies where you see an increase in cytokines, an increase in inflammation, and that stress can lead to autoimmune disorders, which you kind of think of as the opposite, okay? So if it seems confusing, it is, okay? And it's not that like one's wrong or right, it's just that there's lots and lots of evidence that really shows, that really supports kind of both sides of it, okay? So it's super complex, the immune system is super complex, there's so many different immune modulators and molecules. some that act in the periphery, some that act in the central nervous system. Sometimes ones that are in the periphery sneak into the central nervous system when they shouldn't, and they lead to issues. So there's a lot of information on that, and it's confusing probably. So I'm not going to like really ask you about specifically how does stress interact with the immune system. I mean, I guess what I want you guys to understand is that, you know, it could suppress, but it could activate, and it sort of kind of depends on the situation, I guess. So just kind of leave it at that, all right? So I just wanted to kind of bring that up. So I don't expect you guys to completely understand that. And there are some figures, if you look at them, right, where it might be like a little confusing, like what, you know, it kind of doesn't make sense. And that's just because there is conflicting evidence out there, okay? And it's not straightforward or clear cut. Does anyone have any questions about that? No? Okay. So it does in their response mention immune system or immune responses, okay? But again, that question was getting at the idea of, well, do you know what's actually being activated, right, as a result? Okay? And so that's the sort of answer there. I mean, when you think of the idea, right, you guys probably think of this, right, that people who are stressed, or if you're stressed or whatever, that you're more likely to get sick, right? And that's really because of the effects of cortisol. Okay, that's if you have elevated levels of cortisol chronically, it does suppress immune activity. Okay, but like I said, there's other factors that interact with that too. But that's why you hear that. And I think in general, yeah, that's true. It's just about kind of like what you mean by sick, and there's like a lot of other things kind of surrounding that. But in general, if you think of cortisol, right, it does suppress immune activity in general. Okay. All right. Where are we now? What did they ask us for that question? Oh, so as Mr. Cho's immune response continues as a chronic condition, what substances will indicate immunopathology? Okay, so like I'm not going to ask you a question like that. And in fact, I'm not sure they really answer that greatly, but I guess, again, it's just pointing out, okay, increased amounts of cortisol, and also, so it says glucocorticoids. So when it says glucocorticoids, it's referring to cortisol, okay? What about when it says catecholamines? What molecules is it referring to there? Our process of elimination, what do you think? Yeah, norepinephrine and epinephrine are catecholamines. Okay, dopamine is also a catecholamine as well. It's just a category for neurotransmitters / hormones that are of, you know, a certain class. Okay. All right. So anyway, it's just giving you a specific example of some immune-related information to which I don't expect you guys to worry about. Okay. All right. All right, so there's a little more to read, and then there's a couple more questions here. Let me make this bigger. All right, guys, so take a look at that, and then I'll flip the slide, and we'll look at the next. All right, so first, before we move on there, right, at the end of the chapter, I talk about diseases sort of related to stress, right, psychological type of diseases like PTSD. But I also mentioned two others. What are the other two that I mentioned? We'll talk about, yeah.
There's acute stress disorder and then depression and anxiety.
Yeah, you're right. You mentioned acute stress disorder kind of along with PTSD, and then right, depression and anxiety. Okay, so those are kind of the main ones that you would associate with stress, right? For PTSD, it's specifically listing some of these three main categories, right? Re-experiencing the event, feelings of detachment, emotional numbness, and increased arousal. And so what about these like symptoms or these categories of symptoms? Do they usually in PTSD show up right away, right after that traumatic event? They don't. That acute stress disorder, you'll see that the symptoms might show up more quickly and go away a lot quickly, right? A lot more quickly. For PTSD, they show up much later on, right? It could be years later. that you start re-experiencing that event, okay? And then they usually last a pretty long time, okay? And can, again, start interfering with life, right? You start to avoid situations that might remind you at all of the event, okay? All right, so let's see what we got next. Oh, why is it doing this? Sorry for you guys on Zoom if you see it in a weird way, but doesn't really matter as long as you can see the question. Okay, so a little bit more. So it's kind of now describing those kind of different stages you talked about. When you're kind of specifically looking at that sort of model of like a response to stress, right, where it focuses on the response. So I'm talking about stage of alarm, right, stage of resistance, and then this sort of aspects of a stage of exhaustion. All right, so it says, what changes in vital signs may Mr. Cho manifest in the stage of alarm? I think this is kind of redundant. We're going to talk about these too, right? So in stage of alarm, what are you seeing? Increased heart rate, right? Those types of responses, okay? Let's pull what other kind of symptoms they showed here. Right, blood pressure, increased heart rate. Oh, what is this doing? I quit. I don't know why it's doing that. It won't go away. There you go. All right. Okay, if we move on to the next question, again, just trying to kind of get through these. I guess some of these are a little redundant. So describe the factors that may have a mediating effect on Mr. Cho's response to stress. So what'd you guys put for that? And again, the way this is worded is kind of weird, right? Like if you're kind of thinking you got to pull that information right from here, that's not necessarily kind of what they're looking for. They're saying, what are some things that could sort of mediate his response to stress? Yeah.
I don't know if it's what they're looking for, but I basically said there's a lot of factors depending on like his work environment, his stressful genetics, his home environment, his nutrition, his general health, stuff like that.
Okay, yeah, that's good. That's a good point to actually bring up because we didn't really talk about that, right? That there are all these factors that can make you as an individual more susceptible to, you know, having these stress responses occur, right? If you're faced with some sort of stimuli or traumatic event. So that's kind of, it's sort of getting at the sort of coping idea is what they were trying to get at. Okay, again, I'll ask you guys questions in a nice way where you know what I'm trying to ask you. I think they already talked about coping, right? It says here, Mr. Cho may still view the initial event as threatening, but effective adaptation may occur when he feels supported and confident that he can manage the situation. I think that's kind of important to note, right? That the traumatic event's not going away. They're going to forget it, right? But the idea is to be able to use these coping mechanisms so that when you think of that event, it doesn't spark that response, right? That stress response or activate that stress response, okay? All right, if you move down to questions 7 and 8, guys, just to kind of finish this up, we might as well finish it. All right, it's asked about meditation and guided imagery. How can this mediate the stress response? What do you guys write for that? How many somebody you answer? Yeah. Okay. All right, good. What else? What else did you guys say? Yeah.
You can also, depending on the type of meditation you're doing, help alter the way you perceive those memories.
Correct. That's good to bring up, right? So the idea is that you can actually think about that event, right? And try, and you do this repeatedly so that, right, the way that you're perceiving that event is now no longer a threat, right? And so then that response, that stress response will not be an issue, right? Because that perception is changing. So it's the idea is kind of revisiting that event in your mind, but then changing the way you think about it, right? And changing that perception. Yeah, so that's the idea of this kind of like guided imagery. And you can just think of meditation in general, saying that it kind of has this calming effect, right? There's evidence that it decreases heart rate, right? There's also evidence that if you put patients that meditate in under an EEG, that brain activity is decreased, right? So it has that effect as well. So you could have kind of said that too in general. All right, so it asked about cardiovascular fitness. So we kind of talked about that a little bit, right? What'd you guys put for that? Already talked about that, but did anyone kind of put anything different? Yeah.
Somebody with a better overall cardiovascular system will have a better, will be like less susceptible to like heart problems.
Yeah.
than somebody who has-
Yeah, that's good, right? Because it's the idea, right? If you're starting off with a baseline and you have good cardiovascular fitness, right? You're a fit individual. Well, if you have this increased heart rate or maybe it's prolonged for a little bit, maybe it won't affect you as much, right? Yeah. And then we talked about the idea, well, you're raising endorphin levels, right? So maybe that's helping you, the fitness is helping you cope, right, after the fact too. It also could be that like you go running with a friend, right? So the fitness is kind of paired with some social aspect as well. Anything else anyone wants to add to that? All right, so let me see what they put here. Yeah. Pretty much what we said. Okay. All right, so like I said, there is another case study for chapter 4. Good idea to take a look at it. And again, I'm never necessarily looking for exactly what the book is looking for, right? And again, I'll just use these as just providing some background information and then ask you questions that I think are appropriate for given the information, okay? So a lot of times I'm not going to use the questions that they answer, but at least you'll be kind of maybe familiar with what I'm sort of using as the background info, okay? I'm not going to make up my own. I'll just use these that are already there. All right, where are we? We don't have much time left. So like I said, on Monday, we will review. I am more than happy to pull up the lecture for chapter 4. In fact, I'm going to pull it up right now real quick. And go over whatever you need to do. That's true for, or whatever you feel like I need to clarify for chapter 3 as well, or chapter 2. I don't really care. We're going to use Monday though as a review. But if you guys don't come with questions, it's going to not be a very good review, okay? In fact, maybe I'll ask you guys to maybe ask some questions or throw out some questions ahead of time or something like that. I don't know. I'll let you guys know, but either way, be prepared to come with questions, okay? And then that way I can go from there. And I will pull up the PowerPoints and stuff like that. Today, I wanted to make sure we went through that case study and went over the quiz. So, I mean, I guess, if you guys want to go, you're free to go. We only have like 10 minutes left. If you have more questions, I'll stay on. Fine. And then, like I said, be prepared to review on Monday. I'm sure we probably need to spend a little more time with the material. And that's fine. Okay. All right, guys. Probably. I'll let you know. So I'll let you know about Monday if there's going to be in person or if we're just going to do it Zoom. Okay. Yep. You too. I'll stay on if anyone has questions. Okay, guys? Yeah.